So most of us, I think we fundamentally assume we understand how thawing works, right?
Oh, sure. You pull something out of the deep freeze and you just let it sit.
Exactly. You pull it out, you set it on the kitchen counter, and you just walk away. You let the ambient temperature of the room sort of, slowly conquer the cold.
Right, it's passive. It's a really gradual
Yeah, and
process.
that relies entirely on just the slow, natural diffusion of heat, which, is perfectly fine for a frozen steak.
It works great for a steak, but if you take that passive, gradual approach into a clinical embryology lab, it's a completely different
It's a
story.
disaster, right?
Oh, absolute disaster. If you apply that to a vitrified human embryo, you are basically guaranteeing total cellular destruction.
Because it wouldn't just, fail to wake up.
No, it would be chemically and physically shredded from the inside out. Because letting a suspended cell slowly warm up isn't gentle at all. It's a death sentence.
So to bring an embryo back to life, the laboratory can't be passive.
Not even a little bit. They have to launch this highly coordinated, basically violently fast biochemical assault against the laws of thermodynamics.
I love that phrasing, a violent assault against physics.
Yeah.
Because we aren't really thawing anything in the traditional sense, are we?
No, not at all. We are executing a precisely timed, chemically buffered thermal shock. We're forcing biology to bypass the physical laws of crystallization.
And doing it entirely through sheer speed, right?
Sure.
Speed and architectural manipulation.
Exactly. And that high wire act is really our main mission today.
It is. Welcome to our deep dive, everyone. This is episode 15, which is actually the season 1 finale of our deep dives into the IVF laboratory.
It's been a wild ride.
It really has. Throughout this first season, we've mapped out the freezing cold world of cryopreservation. We looked at the intense physics of taking a dynamic biological structure and literally suspending it in time.
Suspending the molecular clock entirely?
Right. And today, we close the loop. We're going to build a complete, scientifically accurate mental map of the entire morning workflow on the actual day of a frozen embryo transfer.
And we really need to look at this not just as a medical procedure, but as an engineering marvel.
For sure. The goal for you, our listener, is to understand the invisible mechanisms at play here.
Waking an embryo is an incredibly active, sophisticated orchestration of fluid dynamics, osmotic pressure, and thermal velocity. It sets the absolute baseline for whether a transfer can even happen.
Okay, so let's set the physical scene for everyone. It's morning. Inside the lab, there's a specialized storage dewar, basically a high-tech thermos filled with liquid nitrogen.
Right.
And deep inside that tank, a patient's future has been held in absolute sub-zero suspension at negative 196 degrees Celsius.
Which is unimaginably cold. At that temperature, all metabolic activity is totally halted.
The biological pause button is held down. But meanwhile, maybe just a few rooms away, the patient is prepped.
The clinical team is scrubbed in and ready to go.
Exactly. Yeah. It's time for the laboratory to hit play. But before that embryo can resume dividing, it has a massive hurdle to clear.
A huge one. Before it can even think about interacting with a uterine lining, it has to survive the journey back to 37 degrees Celsius.
Human body temperature.
Right. And it has to do it without its internal water molecules literally tearing its own structure apart.
Which brings us face to face with the first major biophysical hurdle, the thermal flash.
The flash is everything.
To go from negative 196 degrees up to 37 degrees is a monumental thermal jump. I was reading through the clinical protocols in our sources, and there is a metric here that honestly seems like a typo.
Let me guess. The warming rate.
Yes. It states the required warming rate is 50,000 degrees Celsius per minute. Wait, per minute?
It's definitely not a typo. 50,000 degrees per minute is the benchmark.
How is that even physically possible without instantly boiling the cell?
Ah.
When I think of that kind of thermal velocity, I think of an incinerator.
I know, it sounds insane, but it all comes down to surface area to volume ratios.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Well, the embryo is resting in a fraction of a microliter of fluid. It sits on the absolute edge of a specialized microstraw.
So there's almost no liquid there.
Right. Because the volume of fluid is so infinitesimally small, the thermal transfer happens practically instantaneously when it touches a warm liquid.
So it's microscopic flash heating.
Exactly. But the crucial part isn't just that it's fast. It literally has to be fast to outrun the physics of water.
Right, because of the glass state.
Yeah.
When we covered the freezing process, we talked about how vitrification isn't freezing water into ice, right?
Correct. It's turning water into a supercooled, glass-like state.
You use extreme concentrations of antifreeze, the cryoprotectants, and ultra-rapid cooling to totally dodge the formation of ice crystals.
Because ice crystals expand.
Right.
And if water inside a cell organizes into a rigid crystalline ice structure, those crystals act like microscopic daggers.
Just shredding everything.
They will physically puncture the delicate lipid bilayer of the cell membrane straight from the inside out. Vitrification avoids that by freezing so fast, the water molecules get trapped in a disorganized glass-like suspension.
But here's the catch, right? That glass state is notoriously unstable when you start to actually warm it up.
Highly unstable.
So if you warm it slowly, like leaving that steak on a counter, what actually happens to that supercooled glass?
It goes through a phase we call recrystallization.
Recrystallization. Okay, what does that mean practically?
As the temperature slowly rises, those trapped water molecules suddenly gain just enough thermal energy to move. But they haven't reached a warm liquid state yet.
So they're kind of stuck in purgatory.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
they use that brief window of movement to organize themselves into their preferred lower energy state, which is ice.
Oh, wow. So the ice doesn't actually form during the freeze.
No, it forms during a slow thaw. If the ambient temperature slowly creeps up, the glass melts into ice before it ever melts into water.
And those newly formed ice crystals will shred the embryo just as effectively as if it had been frozen poorly in the first place.
Precisely. It's total destruction.
So this 50,000 degree per minute thermal flash, you are essentially blasting the molecular structure past that danger zone
Blasting right past it.
so rapidly that the water molecules literally don't have the fraction of a millisecond required to organize into a crystal. You go from solid glass straight to warm liquid.
Skipping the ice phase entirely, you are literally outrunning the thermodynamics of crystallization.
That's incredible.
It is, but to pull that off, the embryologist's physical execution has to be flawless. This isn't an automated machine doing the work.
Right, an actual human being is doing this.
Mhm.
An embryologist is manually reaching into the liquid nitrogen tank to retrieve the microstraw.
And remember, liquid nitrogen is boiling at room temperature.
So the second that straw clears the surface of the nitrogen, the ambient air in the laboratory is already trying to warm it.
Which is why the clock doesn't just start, it sprints.
The pressure must be intense.
Oh, it is. The embryologist must pull the straw, move it to the microscope stage, and plunge the tip of it into a pre-warmed drop of warming solution that sits precisely at 37 degrees.
Any hesitation at all, even a second of pausing in the air above the dish.
That pause allows that slow ambient warming to trigger recrystallization, and the embryo dies.
It sort of sounds like a high-speed vehicle merge, like getting on a highway.
That's a good analogy.
If you enter the active lane too slowly, you cause an immediate collision. The embryo has to merge back into physiological temperatures instantly.
There's no easing into it. It requires immense spatial awareness. The embryologist is looking through a microscope eyepiece while simultaneously manipulating a delicate straw with their hands.
They're not even looking at their hands.
Nope. They have to rely on deep muscle memory. They physically strip the fluid containing the embryo off the straw and disperse it into the warm 37-degree media instantly.
I imagine that sudden change in temperature causes some massive turbulence at the microscopic level.
Oh, massive. The embryo is suddenly swirling around in this huge ocean of warm fluid.
And the embryologist has to find it immediately amidst that turbulence.
They do, because surviving the thermal flash is only the first second of the process.
Wait, really? The flash is just step one?
Just step one. The heat solves the physical problem of ice, but it instantly triggers a severe chemical crisis.
Right, because the embryo is still packed full of the cryoprotectants,
Yep.
antifreeze.
Exactly. When the embryo was frozen, it was saturated with chemicals like ethylene glycol or dimethyl sulfoxide.
Which are potent antifreezes.
Very potent. At negative 196 degrees, molecular motion is stopped, so those chemicals are inert. They don't cause harm.
But the moment the embryo hits 37 degrees, I assume those chemicals wake up.
They do. They become highly active and highly toxic to the cellular machinery.
So it's a ticking clock. The embryo is warm, it's alive, but it is basically stewing in its own internal poison.
That's exactly what's happening.
So why is this complicated? If it's swimming in a drop of warm liquid, why can't we just pick it up, wash it off in regular water or standard culture media, and just be done with it?
Because of the ruthless laws of osmotic pressure.
Osmotic pressure. Okay, break that down for us.
Well, if you take a cell that is hyper-concentrated with heavy antifreeze molecules and you drop it directly into pure water or even standard culture media,
You create an extreme osmotic gradient.
Right. The water outside the cell desperately wants to balance the concentration inside the cell.
The cell membrane is a lipid bilayer, right? Highly permeable to water.
Very permeable to water, but much less permeable to those large, heavy, cryoprotectant molecules.
So if you drop that saturated embryo into a normal solution, water will just aggressively flood into the cell.
Exactly. It rushes in trying to dilute the internal antifreeze, but the antifreeze can't get out fast enough to make room.
So the cell just fills up with water.
It fills up incredibly fast. It will stretch, balloon out, and ultimately rupture. The cell simply explodes from the internal hydrostatic pressure. Yeah, this is what we call osmotic shock.
Okay, that clicks. We actually touched on this dynamic briefly when we were looking at the cryopreservation of the unfertilized egg, the oocyte.
Yes, the oocyte is a perfect example.
Depending on whether that oocyte was at the M1 or M2 stage of meiotic maturation, the internal water volume and the elasticity of the membrane were highly variable.
Managing the fluid exchange across that membrane was the hardest part of the freeze for the oocyte.
Right, and now we're doing it in reverse, with a multi-cell blastocyst.
But the biophysics of water crossing that membrane remains the absolute dictator of survival. It's a critical parallel.
So how do we manage it? The oocyte and the blastocyst are different structures, obviously.
They are, but the lipid bilayer behaves the same way. Water moves incredibly fast. Cryoprotectants move slowly. You basically have a massive traffic jam at the cellular membrane.
And to manage that traffic jam, we can't just wash the embryo in normal media.
No. We have to perform a highly controlled rehydration dance using a sucrose dilution gradient.
Sucrose. As in, literally the exact same molecule we use for table sugar.
A highly purified, laboratory-grade version of it, but yes, table sugar.
That's wild. Is it feeding the embryo?
Not at all. It is not acting as a nutrient here. It is acting as a physical tool.
How does sugar act as a tool?
Sucrose is a disaccharide, meaning it's a relatively large molecule. Crucially, it does not easily pass through the embryo's cell membrane.
Okay, so if you put the embryo into a solution that is heavily saturated with sucrose, the sugar stays on the outside of the cell.
Exactly. And because there is a massive concentration of sucrose on the outside of the cell, it exerts external osmotic pressure.
Think of the sucrose molecules as a massive crowd of bouncers standing right outside the doors of a nightclub.
I love that.
Okay, so the water molecules are the general public trying to violently rush into the club, and the cryoprotectants are the VIPs trying to slowly leave.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. If the bouncers, the sucrose, weren't there, the water would violently rush the doors, overwhelming the structure.
But because the external environment is artificially thick with sugar,
The water is held back. It doesn't feel that intense thermodynamic drive to rush in because the outside environment is just as highly concentrated as the inside environment.
which buys the whole system time.
Exactly. It buys the heavy cryoprotectant molecules the vital minutes they need to slowly diffuse out of the cell and into the surrounding fluid.
They move down their own concentration gradient without being trampled by incoming water.
Precisely. But of course, the embryo can't stay in a heavy sugar syrup forever.
Right, you have to eventually get it back to a normal physiological state.
So the embryologist manually moves the embryo through a precise sequence of droplets. They start in a dilution solution with a very high concentration of sucrose.
And then what?
After a few minutes, they physically pick the embryo up with a pipette and move it to a second droplet with a slightly lower concentration of sucrose.
You are slowly dismissing the bouncers.
Yes. As the antifreeze slowly leaves the cell, you need less external pressure to hold the water back. You step the sucrose concentration down, droplet by droplet,
So with each move, a little more water is allowed to gently re-enter the cell.
perfectly replacing the volume of the exiting cryoprotectants. Eventually, you reach the washing solutions, which have 0 sucrose and 0 cryoprotectant.
That is a delicate dance. What is the embryologist actually seeing during all of this? They are staring down the optics of a microscope while they move this embryo from drop to drop.
Yes, and it is intensely visual. The embryologist is watching the biophysics happen in real time.
Does the cell physically change shape?
It does. When the embryo first hits that heavy sucrose dilution solution, the immediate external pressure actually pulls a bit of the remaining water out of the cell.
Wait, it loses water.
Yeah, so the embryo initially shrinks, it shrivels up slightly.
Oh, that sounds absolutely terrifying to watch.
It can be, but it is a totally normal, expected physiological response. Then, as the cryoprotectants slowly diffuse out and water begins to slowly trickle back in,
The embryologist watches the embryo gradually swell back to its normal volume.
right. And they're evaluating this shrinking and swelling pattern intensely. They look at the smoothness of the membrane as it expands.
Almost like watching a lung slowly inflate and deflate.
Exactly. If it swells too fast or if the edges look jagged, it tells the embryologist immediately that the cell membrane has lost its integrity.
So they aren't just blindly following a timer, like 3 minutes and drop A, 3 minutes and drop.
Not at all. They are using the physical deformation of the cell as a real-time diagnostic indicator of membrane health.
The timer's the baseline, but the visual feedback is the actual confirmation.
Exactly. The embryologist is actively ensuring that osmotic equilibrium is achieved smoothly at every single step down the gradient.
Which brings us to what has to be the most agonizing moment of the morning.
The post-thaw check.
Right. The chemistry is finally balanced, the antifreeze is gone, the sucrose has been washed away, the embryo is now resting in standard physiological culture media.
Safe and sound, hopefully.
But now the lab has to answer the ultimate question. Did it survive the violence of the thermal flash and the stress of the rehydration dance?
This is where we transition from pure chemistry back to pure biology. We need to evaluate the structural and cellular health of the blastocyst.
So the embryologist is looking through a high-powered inverted microscope, likely using phase contrast optics, right?
Yes, very high magnification.
What separates a healthy surviving embryo from one that has succumbed to the thaw? What are they looking for?
They are evaluating the architecture of two distinct cellular regions. First, the inner cell mass, which is a tight cluster of cells that is actually destined to become the fetus.
Okay, the inner cell mass. And the second?
The trophectoderm. That's the outer spherical layer of cells that will eventually form the placenta and establish the pregnancy.
So what does a microscopic casualty actually look like? If a cell didn't make it, what is the visual evidence?
Well, when a cell membrane ruptures, whether from a rogue ice crystal or osmotic shock, it physically breaks open.
And leaks out.
Yeah, it leaks its internal cytoplasm into the surrounding space. Under phase contrast microscopy, that leaked cellular material looks like dark, granular, necrotic debris.
It's just disorganized.
Highly disorganized.
Cool.
So an embryologist is primarily looking for the absence of that dark debris.
They want it to look clean.
They want it to look exceptionally clean. The individual cells of the trophectoderm should have crisp, well-defined borders.
I read about something called the resumption of cellular brightness. What is that?
Oh, it's beautiful. After the stress of the freeze and thaw, surviving cells undergo a visual transformation. They literally appear brighter, more robust, and structurally cohesive.
And the inner cell mass should be tightly packed and highly organized.
Exactly.
For a patient sitting at home or maybe sitting in the clinic waiting room, this specific span of time has to be absolute torture.
It's incredibly stressful.
They know their embryo is taken out of the tank, but they don't know if it survived. When we look at the data across modern, high-quality IVF laboratories, what are the actual odds of survival?
It's totally normal to feel that anxiety, but the data is incredibly reassuring.
Really? How reassuring?
Before the widespread adoption of vitrification, back when we used slow freezing methods, survival rates were much lower and highly variable. But today...
Today we have the thermal flash.
Right, the combination of advanced cryoprotecting chemistry and that 50,000-degree thermal flash has revolutionized the field.
Assuming you're starting with a high-quality blastocyst, what are we talking?
Modern survival rates typically exceed 95 to 98% in experienced labs.
That is staggering.
Yeah.
Truly staggering.
It really is.
You subject a microscopic sphere of water and lipids to a 200-degree temperature swing in less than a second, manipulate its internal chemistry with sugar gradients, and it survives 98% of the time.
It is a testament to the sheer resilience of the biological unit, paired with the intense refinement of laboratory protocols.
But survival isn't the final milestone before transfer, is it? There is still an incubation window.
Right. The protocols indicate that once the embryo is washed and graded, it is placed into a highly controlled incubator for anywhere from 1 to 4 hours before the actual transfer takes place.
Why the delay? If it looks healthy and the membranes are intact, why not load it into a catheter immediately?
Because we want to give the embryo time to prove that its internal metabolic machinery is actually working. We are looking for the re-expansion phase.
Re-expansion of what exactly?
Of the blastocyst cavity. A blastocyst is essentially a microscopic, fluid-filled biological balloon.
Okay.
When it was initially frozen, that central fluid cavity collapsed. The embryo shrunk down to survive the freeze.
Ah, so it expelled all its water.
Yes. Now that it is warm and resting in nutrient-rich media, the healthy trophectoderm cells on the outside will turn their microscopic pumps back on.
Wait, cellular pumps? Like active mechanical transport?
Exactly. Specifically, sodium-potassium ATPase pumps located on the cell membranes.
What do they do?
These proteins use metabolic energy to pump ions across the membrane, which dynamically draws fluid from the surrounding culture media back into the central cavity of the embryo.
So it actively inflates itself back up.
It does. It's not just passively absorbing water like a sponge. It is burning energy to actively reconstruct its own internal architecture.
That sounds like a metabolically expensive process.
It is highly expensive, and that is exactly why the embryologist watches for it. Seeing an embryo actively re-expand or even begin to hatch out of its outer shell, the zona pellucida.
That's the ultimate functional proof of life.
Exactly. It confirms that the physical structure survived and the enzymatic and metabolic engines inside the cells are fully operational.
I want to pause right here and dig into something that causes a massive amount of stress for patients who read their embryology reports.
Okay, what is it?
Let's say a patient has a transfer scheduled for noon. At 11:30 a.m., the embryologist looks at the embryo. The cells are intact, there is no necrotic debris, it looks bright and healthy, but the central cavity hasn't fully puffed back up. It hasn't completely re-expanded. I have seen patients panic over this, assuming the cycle should be canceled because the embryo is slow.
Oh, I see this all the time.
Is the lack of full re-expansion prior to transfer a sign of failure?
No, absolutely not, and it is vital we clarify that. It is a very common misconception.
So it's perfectly fine if it's not fully expanded.
Expecting every embryo to fully re-expand on a rigid 2-hour timeline is like expecting every human being to wake up and immediately sprint a mile.
Right. Biology does not operate on a standardized train schedule.
Exactly. Some people need 3 cups of coffee and an hour of silence before they're functional.
That would be me.
Right. Re-expansion is a highly individual, dynamic biological rhythm. Some embryos will pop open and look fully inflated in 45 minutes. Others might take 3 or 4 hours.
And what if they don't expand before the transfer happens?
Here is the most important clinical reality. Many embryos will not finish expanding until after they have been transferred into the warm, nutrient-dense environment of the uterus.
Really? And those embryos still implant?
All the time. They go on to result in perfectly healthy, successful pregnancies.
So the lab is looking for evidence of active recovery, not a finalized state of expansion.
Exactly. As long as the embryologist confirms the structural integrity of the cells and verifies the absence of degeneration, the embryo is healthy and viable.
Full re-expansion at the exact minute of transfer is basically a bonus, not a baseline requirement.
Exactly.
But let's look at the darker side of this workflow. We don't live in a perfect world.
We don't.
Biology is inherently unpredictable, and occasionally an embryo does not survive the warming process. The laboratory cannot rely purely on optimism.
No. They must have a deeply ingrained system for managing a failure. Every top-tier laboratory does. It is a critical part of the standard operating procedure.
When you're dealing with living cells, you must have a contingency plan that can be executed in minutes. What exactly triggers that contingency plan? What defines a definitive thaw failure?
A failure is characterized by widespread, irreversible cellular degeneration.
So going back to what we talked about earlier, lots of dark debris.
Yes. The embryologist looks down the microscope and sees that the architecture has collapsed. The inner cell mass is disorganized or fragmented.
And the trophectoderm.
It's overwhelmingly dark and granular, indicating that the majority of the cell membranes have ruptured. The embryo has lost its structural cohesion.
Which means it cannot pump fluid, it cannot metabolize energy, and it has zero potential to implant.
Right. That is an incredibly heavy realization for the embryologist sitting on a bench.
I can only imagine. What is the immediate chain of command when that happens?
The warming bench immediately shifts into a stop-the-line protocol. The embryologist pauses everything, documents the failure, and immediately alerts the lab director and the attending physician.
Because the clock is ticking on the clinical side. The patient is already there.
That is the most intense pressure of the scenario. The patient is likely already at the clinic. Their physical body, their uterine lining has been meticulously prepped with a very specific time-sensitive protocol of estrogen and progesterone.
The biological window of implantation in the uterus is actively opening, and it will not stay open forever.
So the lab has to pivot instantly.
If the patient has additional cryopreserved embryos in storage, what happens next?
This is where patient consent is paramount. If the previously signed legal consent forms explicitly permit the thawing of a backup embryo in the event of a primary failure.
The laboratory initiates the backup protocol immediately,
Right. The embryologist identifies a secondary straw in the nitrogen tank.
and they have to compartmentalize the failure they just witnessed and execute the entire highly complex biophysical process again, from scratch.
They have to completely reset their cognitive focus. They must execute the 50,000-degree thermal flash, navigate the sucrose dilution gradient without inducing osmotic shock, and perform the microscopic grading all over again.
Flawlessly, while under an intense time crunch.
Exactly. They are essentially moving mountains in the background to ensure that the patient's clinical transfer window is perfectly respected.
The patient might literally be sitting in the pre-op room, reading a magazine, completely unaware of the flurry of adrenaline and precision happening behind the laboratory doors.
It is the ultimate stress test of a lab's operational integrity. Being able to absorb a failure, communicate it efficiently, and successfully warm a backup embryo without compromising safety is the hallmark of a truly elite IVF laboratory.
So let's fast forward and assume the absolute best-case scenario.
Okay, the happy path.
We have a bright, healthy, intact embryo resting safely in the incubator. It has survived the thermal shock and the chemical wash.
Ready to go.
Now, the entire focus of the laboratory shifts. We move from microscopic biology to extreme logistics. We have to physically move this microscopic sphere of cells from a dish on a lab bench into the patient.
And this transition is where security protocols become just as important as the biological protocols.
The outline notes something called the sterile cockpit principle. I actually recognize that term from commercial aviation.
Yes, it's a direct crossover.
During takeoff and landing, pilots are strictly forbidden from discussing anything other than the immediate flight parameters to eliminate cognitive distraction. Does the lab do that?
The IVF laboratory adopts that exact same philosophy for the transfer preparation. Before the embryo is ever removed from the incubator, the embryologist's workbench is physically and mentally cleared.
So no other files around.
No other patient files are allowed on the desk. No other culture dishes are present. Background conversation is completely stopped.
Wow, they take it seriously.
The embryologist is preparing to load a human embryo into a transport vehicle, and there is zero margin for an identity error.
Walk us through the identity verification process, because placing the wrong embryo into the wrong patient is the absolute nightmare scenario in this field. How does the lab guarantee that never happens?
It requires an obsessive, redundant, triple match lock. First, the embryologist takes the physical clinical chart for the transfer. They read the patient's full legal name, their unique medical record number, and the highly specific alphanumeric code that was printed on the embryo's original freezing straw.
And they aren't just reading this silently in their head, are they?
No, they read it aloud. And they read it aloud to a mandatory secondary human witness.
So a single embryologist will never execute a transfer preparation alone.
Never. A second, fully trained embryologist must physically look at the dish, look at the paperwork, and verbally confirm that every single letter and number matches perfectly.
But we don't just rely on human eyes anymore, do we?
Yeah.
Human error is still, a statistical reality.
Which is why modern labs layer advanced electronic witnessing over the human element.
Electronic witnessing, like barcodes.
We utilize radio frequency identification RFID tags or specialized microbarcodes. These are physically adhered to the bottom of the culture dishes and integrated into the patient's digital medical file.
So the bench itself is actively monitoring the workspace.
Exactly. When the dish is brought to the microscope, an electronic scanner reads the tag.
What happens if there's a mismatch?
If a dish is placed on a bench that does not mathematically match the active patient file pulled up on the monitor, the system triggers a hard lockdown.
A hard lockdown.
Alarms sound, screens flash red, and the staff is immediately alerted to a discrepancy.
This means that before the embryo is even touched, the laboratory ecosystem and the clinical procedure room sync up entirely.
Right. The nurse in the procedure room confirms the patient is physically on the table, ID verified.
The electronic system confirms the dish matches the file. The secondary embryologist confirms the paperwork matches the dish. It is a web of interlocking security.
The entire architecture of the protocol is designed so that an identity mix-up isn't just against the rules. It is procedurally and structurally impossible to execute.
Okay, so identity is definitively locked. The patient is prepped. Now we arrive at what I find to be the most mechanically fascinating aspect of the entire morning.
Loading the catheter.
Yes. We have to capture a microscopic, invisible entity into a long, thin tube and keep it safe during transport.
This requires an understanding of fluid dynamics within a capillary tube.
The embryologist cannot just stick a syringe into the dish and suck the embryo up blindly, can they?
No, they have to intentionally engineer a microscopic fluid environment inside that catheter.
And to do that, they use a highly specific instrument. Our sources highlight the micrometer syringe. How is this different from, say, the plastic syringe I'd see a nurse use to draw blood?
A standard medical syringe is designed to move massive amounts of fluid, milliliters. If you pull the plunger back even a millimeter on a normal syringe, you move a huge volume of liquid.
And the micrometer syringe.
The micrometer syringe used in the IVF lab is a heavy, precision-machined instrument, often made of glass and metal. It is designed to manipulate fractions of a single microliter.
Fractions of a microliter, that's microscopic.
The embryologist turns a finely threaded dial on the back, and it translates large hand movements into microscopic, incredibly slow movements of the plunger.
Because they need to precisely control the flow of fluid at a microscopic scale.
Exactly. And they use this tool to build what is called the microfluid sandwich inside the tip of the catheter.
Break down the architecture of this sandwich. What exactly is the embryologist drawing up into the tube?
It is a deliberate 5-part sequence. The embryologist looks through the microscope, guiding the incredibly fine tip of the transfer catheter.
Layer 1.
First, they use the micrometer syringe to draw up a lead layer of standard culture media. This clears any potential microscopic debris from the tip and coats the internal walls of the plastic tube to prevent sticking.
Okay, layer 1 is media.
Second, they lift the catheter out of the fluid and pull in a very small, meticulously measured pocket of ambient air.
Air.
Third, they lower the tip directly over the embryo and draw up the tiny fluid droplet containing the blastocyst itself.
That's the payload.
Fourth, another small pocket of air. And finally, a closing cap of culture media to seal the tip.
Media, air, embryo, air, media.
That's the sandwich.
I have to push back on this. Every medical drama on television has taught us that injecting an air bubble into a human body is a lethal mistake. Why are we intentionally sandwiching an embryo between two pockets of air?
In a vascular setting, like an IV line, entering a vein air is absolutely dangerous. But an embryo transfer catheter is not going into the bloodstream.
Where is it going?
It is navigating through the cervix and into the potential space of the uterine cavity. In this specific environment, those air bubbles serve two indispensable purposes. First, they act as mechanical bumpers.
Bumpers, like physical barriers.
Exactly. We are dealing with capillary action. If you just drew the embryo up in a continuous column of fluid, the fluid might naturally wick further up the long tube of the catheter,
Taking the embryo with it, far away from the tip.
or gravity might cause the fluid to slowly drip out while the embryologist is walking to the procedure room.
So the air breaks the capillary action.
The surface tension of the fluid droplet meets the air pocket, and it stops dead. The air locks the fluid droplet containing the embryo securely in place, exactly where the embryologist positioned it.
It provides physical containment. That is incredibly clever. You're using surface tension to build a temporary wall. What is the second purpose of the air?
Echogenicity. Visibility on an ultrasound monitor.
Because the specialist can't see the embryo.
Right, when the specialist is guiding the catheter into the uterus, they cannot see the embryo. It is microscopic. And they can barely see the thin plastic of the catheter against the thick tissue of the uterine lining.
Because fluid and tissue both transmit sound waves similarly.
Exactly. But air creates a massive acoustic impedance mismatch. Ultrasound waves hit those tiny pockets of air and reflect brilliantly back to the probe.
So the air bubbles literally light up on the screen.
They appear as two stark, intensely bright white markers on the ultrasound monitor.
That is brilliant.
The specialist can track those two white dots navigating through the cervical canal and smoothly entering the uterine cavity. They know with absolute visual certainty that the invisible embryo is tucked safely right in the dark space between those two brilliant markers.
They can guide that sandwich to the exact optimal implantation site, usually a centimeter or two from the top of the uterus, before gently depressing the plunger.
It is an elegant solution to a massive biological blind spot. You use air to build a high-visibility tracking beacon around an invisible payload.
Now, what about the volume of the fluid droplet itself? The fluid actually holding the embryo. Why use a micrometer syringe to keep that volume so small?
We have to respect the physical environment of the uterus. The uterine cavity is not a vast open cavern like a balloon. It is a potential space.
Meaning the walls are touching.
The front and back walls of the uterus are essentially touching each other, lined with a thick, sticky layer of endometrial tissue.
So if you inject a large volume of liquid in there.
You create a hydraulic wave. If the embryologist loaded the embryo in a whole milliliter of fluid, pressing the plunger would blast that fluid into the cavity.
Well, what would that do?
The sheer force of that hydraulic current could literally wash the embryo back down through the cervix and out of the body. Or, conversely, it could flush the embryo upward deep into the fallopian tubes.
Which dramatically increases the risk of an ectopic pregnancy.
Precisely. By keeping the fluid volume to a tiny fraction of a microliter, you prevent the wave,
You just gently place the tiny droplet onto the sticky endometrial lining.
allowing the embryo to adhere immediately without disrupting the surrounding physical environment.
The biophysics of a single drop of water dictate the success of the entire cycle. It's wild. So the microfluid sandwich is perfectly assembled. The embryo is protected by its air bumpers. Now, the embryologist has to actually get it into the room with the patient.
And this brings us to the final logistics protocol, hand-to-hand accountability.
I noticed a specific architectural detail mentioned in the laboratory design sources. Many modern high-security IVF clinics intentionally build solid walls between the laboratory and the clinical procedure room.
Yes, very common now.
They avoid using pass-through windows or automated drop boxes. From an efficiency standpoint, a little window in the wall seems like it would be much faster than walking through a door. Why design it this way?
Because efficiency can never trump environmental stability. Consider the immense effort we have expended to maintain strict control. The embryo has been kept at precisely 37 degrees Celsius in a highly controlled, positive pressure clean room.
Right, and pass-through windows are a massive environmental vulnerability.
They create drafts. The laboratory operates at a positive air pressure to push airborne particulates out. The clinical procedure room is a higher traffic area with completely different HVAC requirements.
If you open a window between them, you instantly disrupt that pressure gradient.
You invite turbulent air and temperature fluctuations. The thin plastic of the transfer catheter offers very little thermal mass. A sudden draft of cool air from a pass-through window could drop the temperature of the microfluid sandwich in seconds.
Cold shocking the embryo right before transfer.
Exactly.
Beyond the physics, there is also a psychological component, isn't there?
Absolutely. Passing a catheter through a slot in the wall is highly transactional. It structurally separates the embryology team from the clinical team.
And you want them united.
The gold standard is continuous, unbroken human accountability. We insist on direct hand-to-hand delivery.
Visualize that physical journey for us. The embryologist has successfully loaded the catheter.
The embryologist steps back from the microscope workstation. They hold the catheter perfectly upright, ensuring gravity doesn't act on the internal fluid dynamics.
Do they cover it?
They often use their forearm or a specialized sterile sleeve to deliberately shield the thin tubing from the bright overhead lights and ambient air. Then they physically walk out of the laboratory doors and directly into the adjacent procedure room.
Entering the clinical space where the patient and the physician are waiting.
They walk directly up to the physician. The handoff is a literal finger-to-finger transfer. The embryologist places the rigid base of the catheter directly into the sterile gloves of the specialist.
And there's one final verbal security lock right here at the finish line, isn't there?
Yes. During that exact moment of physical transfer, the embryologist looks at the physician and states the patient's full legal name aloud one final time.
The physician hears it, acknowledges it, and turns directly to the patient on the table to confirm.
It closes the loop in real time. Safety isn't outsourced to a passive window or a barcode scanner at this final stage. It is grounded in face-to-face human accountability.
The lab and the clinic physically merge to complete the task.
The human element of care remains paramount right up until the plunger is pushed.
So the specialist takes the catheter. They use the ultrasound to guide those bright white air bubbles to the top of the uterine cavity. They gently depress the plunger. They slowly withdraw the empty plastic tube. The procedure is over.
The patient can relax.
The lab isn't done yet, are they?
The clinical intervention is finished, but the laboratory protocol requires one final step to officially close the cycle. We call it the clearance log, or the retained embryo check.
Wait, retained embryo? You mean there is a chance the embryo is still inside the plastic tube?
It is a rare occurrence, but yes, it is a physical possibility.
How does that even happen?
Remember, the embryo is microscopic, and it was suspended in an incredibly tiny volume of viscous fluid. occasionally due to static electricity or surface tension, or a small plug of cervical mucus that interacted with the tip of the catheter.
The fluid droplet simply doesn't deploy when the plunger is pressed.
The embryo remains stuck to the inner wall of the tubing.
That sounds like an absolute nightmare. How does the team even know if that happened?
Because we never assume, we verify. The moment the specialist withdraws the catheter from the patient, they do not throw it in the biohazard bin.
They hand it back.
They immediately hand it straight back to the embryologist. The embryologist takes that used catheter, walks back into the lab, and places the tip directly under the microscope.
And what is the specific mechanism for checking it?
The embryologist takes a larger syringe filled with fresh culture media, attaches it to the back of the used catheter, and forcefully flushes the internal tubing, the lumen out, into a completely clean, empty culture dish.
Then what?
Then they methodically scan every single millimeter of that flush fluid under high magnification.
They are hunting for the embryo.
They are confirming its absence. If they scan the entire dish and find nothing but clean fluid, it is a definitive success.
They sign off.
They sign their name to the clearance log, they call out catheter clear to the procedure room, and the cycle is officially closed. The physics guarantee that the embryo was successfully deposited in the uterus.
But let's look at the alternative. Because the phrase retained embryo sounds like a catastrophic, cycle-ending failure. What happens if the embryologist flushes the tubing, scans the dish, and sees the embryo sitting right there?
It is crucial to understand that a retained embryo is not a catastrophe. It is merely a logistical delay.
Really? The embryo isn't damaged.
The embryo is perfectly safe. It is resting comfortably in a pool of warm, buffered culture media in a highly controlled environment.
So it hasn't been harmed by being pushed through the tube and pulled back out.
Not at all. If the embryologist spots the embryo, they simply maintain their composure, call out retained embryo to the procedure room, and immediately prep a brand new sterile transfer catheter.
They build a new microfluid sandwich, reload the embryo, walk it back into the room, and the physician performs the transfer a second time.
Exact.
Does a second attempt impact the patient's actual chances of getting pregnant?
Extensive clinical data over decades has tracked this exact scenario. The data conclusively shows that if an embryo is retained and immediately retransferred during the same appointment, there is absolutely zero negative impact on implantation potential or live birth success rates.
The procedure is just repeated.
Yep. The retained embryo check isn't about fixing a broken embryo, it's about enforcing a zero-tolerance policy for uncertainty.
It guarantees that no patient ever leaves the clinic without absolute scientific confirmation that their embryo was safely delivered.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the laboratory's philosophy. Trust nothing, verify everything.
Which is a really profound way to summarize our entire journey today, and truly, the entirety of Season 1.
It's been an amazing season.
When we began this deep dive weeks ago, we explored how cryopreservation forces biology into a state of paused animation. But today, we've witnessed the breathtaking complexity of the reawakening.
We've seen that it is far more than just taking a cell out of the freezer.
Absolutely. We followed a microscopic cluster of cells from the absolute zero immersion of a liquid nitrogen tank through a violently precise 50,000 degree per minute thermal flash designed to outrun the thermodynamics of ice.
We mapped the intricate chemistry of the rehydration dance.
Using sucrose gradients as molecular bouncers to prevent osmotic explosions, we examined the biological resilience required to actively re-expand a cellular cavity.
And we explored the intricate fluid mechanics of loading a micro sandwich bordered by echogenic air bubbles.
And finally, we saw how all of this advanced biophysics is protected by rigorous, face-to-face human accountability.
When you look at the entirety of the morning workflow, you realize that waking an embryo is a true masterpiece of applied biophysics.
It demands an absolute, uncompromising mastery over thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, and molecular chemistry.
All executed flawlessly under the immense emotional and logistical pressure of real-time clinical care.
And as we close out this season, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Throughout all these deep dives, we have focused heavily on human engineering, right? The microscopes, the lasers, the cryoprotectants, the thermal velocity.
The tools.
But take a moment to consider the sheer, almost incomprehensible resilience of life itself.
The biological unit at the center of all this technology.
Exactly. Human ingenuity has figured out how to temporarily hijack the laws of thermodynamics, to pause the most delicate biological developmental sequence on Earth.
But the biology itself, that tiny, fragile, microscopic sphere of lipids, proteins, and water, is robust enough to endure a journey to negative 196 degrees.
Rush back to physiological life in a fraction of a millisecond.
Chemically rebalance its own interior.
Physically reinflate its own architecture and go on to become a living, breathing human being. We build the tools, but the biology does the surviving. It is nothing short of miraculous.
It is the most profound intersection of human engineering and natural resilience imaginable. It has been an absolute privilege to map out these foundational laboratory processes with you over the course of this season.
So with that, we officially conclude Season 1 of our journey through the IVF lab. Thank you for joining us as we explored everything from the raw mechanics of fertilization checks to the deep freeze, and finally, today's awe-inspiring reawakening.
You now possess a comprehensive, deeply scientific mental map of the foundational embryology workflow.
But the capabilities of the modern laboratory extend far beyond the foundations. As we look ahead to the launch of Season 2, we are going to shift our lens from the foundational workflows into the incredibly advanced realm of genetic diagnostics and cellular microsurgery.
I am so excited for this.
I am thrilled to announce that Season 2 will kick off with Episode 16, which will be entirely focused on PGT biopsy.
We're going to zoom in on the absolute peak of embryological precision.
We will dissect exactly how embryologists use microscopically targeted, computer-controlled pulses of an infrared laser to physically separate and detach a few outer placental cells from a living embryo.
We will explore the rigorous techniques required to capture those specific cells, load them into specialized microtubes for comprehensive genetic sequencing.
And doing it all without ever compromising the integrity of the inner cell mass that will become the fetus.
It is next-level futuristic science happening right now, and you absolutely will not want to miss it.
We invite you to return and join us for that next exploration. Until then, remember that beneath every clinical outcome, there is an invisible world of molecular physics happening in real time. Thank you for listening, and we will see you in Season 2.